In the stillness of the night, deep in the heart of a quiet mountain forest, Magnus wandered, as he often did. He had lived here for years, hiding from the world, buried beneath the weight of his own painful past. His heart, once open and full of hope, had been closed off after a series of betrayals, disappointments, and the crushing loss of someone he loved. Love had become a distant memory for him, a concept he no longer believed in. He had come to terms with loneliness, built his life around it, and accepted that true connection might never find its way back into his world. But one night, everything changed. A thick mist rolled in, blanketing the forest in an eerie quiet. The air felt charged, like something was about to happen. Magnus, lost in his thoughts, barely noticed the rustle of leaves ahead of him, the soft sound of footsteps that didn't belong to him. He froze, his senses alert. There, between the trees, a figure emerged. A woman, running, her breath ragged as she glanced over her shoulder, fear written across her face. She was in trouble. That much was clear. Magnus instinctively stepped forward, his body moving before his mind could catch up. His heart raced, not from fear, but from something else. Something unfamiliar, something he hadn't felt in years. The woman's eyes met his, and time seemed to stand still. For a brief moment, everything around them faded. The world, with all its noise and chaos, was gone. There was only the two of them, locked in a gaze that spoke volumes without a single word. Her eyes, wide with fear but also something softer, something he couldn't quite place, pulled at him in ways he couldn't explain. And her face, though tense with the terror of being chased, seemed to soften just slightly when she saw him. It was as if, in that moment, she saw something in him, something that gave her comfort. A strange, inexplicable safety. Magnus, still frozen in that spellbinding gaze, finally found his voice. Are you okay?" His words came out more hesitant than he intended. He wasn't used to speaking to strangers, let alone ones who seemed to be running for their life. The woman's chest heaved as she took a step back, scanning the darkness behind her. She was clearly on edge, every muscle tensed, ready to bolt at any moment. But instead of running, she turned her attention back to him, her eyes filled with both fear and a strange desperation. I don't want to drag you into this," she said, her voice trembling. "But I don't have a choice." Her words left Magnus with more questions than answers. What was she running from? Who was chasing her? And why did she seem so vulnerable? Yet somehow, in that brief exchange, also strangely strong. His instincts told him that this wasn't just any ordinary situation. And his heart, that guarded, hardened heart, was suddenly alive again. The woman took a cautious step forward, eyes still darting nervously. But there was something in the way she looked at him that made his chest tighten. It wasn't just fear. There was something else there. Something almost familiar. The connection was undeniable but impossible to explain. He felt an inexplicable pull toward her, as if the universe had somehow conspired to bring them together in this very moment. "Who's chasing you?" Magnus asked, the concern in his voice more evident now. He took another step closer, instinctively wanting to protect her, even though he barely knew who she was. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that she wasn't alone anymore, not if he could help it. The woman hesitated for a moment, her gaze shifting to the trees once again. I'm not sure how to explain it, but they're not human," she whispered, almost as if she feared the very air itself would carry her words to someone who shouldn't hear them. They're called shadows, and they've been hunting me for weeks." Magnus felt his stomach tighten at her words, the weight of their meaning sinking in. The shadows. They didn't sound like anyone or anything he had ever encountered before. But there was something in the way she said it, her voice shaking with both fear and something deeper, something more personal, that struck a chord within him. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just walk away, not after what he had just felt between them. The world around them seemed to disappear as Magnus moved closer, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to face this alone," he said, a determination in his words that surprised even him. He was a man who had sworn off connections, who had closed himself off from the world. Yet here he was, offering his help to a stranger, a woman he had just met, driven by something far beyond logic. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice soft, almost incredulous. "You don't even know me." Magnus didn't have an answer, not one that made sense. But in that moment, he realized that he didn't need one. Something about her had drawn him in, had shattered the walls he had so carefully built around his heart. And in that instant he knew. He had to protect her. Not because it made sense, not because he owed her anything, but because, somehow, in her eyes, he saw something he thought he had lost forever. "I don't need to know you to know that you're not alone," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos brewing around them. "I'll help you. I'll keep you safe." The words hung in the air between them, and in that fleeting moment, everything shifted. It wasn't just the start of a journey to protect a stranger. It was the beginning of something neither of them could yet understand. But the connection between them, that undeniable spark, was enough to make them both believe that for the first time in a long while, they weren't just two souls passing in the night. They were meant to meet. They were meant to fight for something, together. And so, with a look of quiet resolve, Lyra took a step toward him, her fear momentarily quieted by the promise of his words. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Magnus had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary encounter. This was the beginning of something that would change everything. After narrowly escaping the relentless pursuit of the shadows, Magnus led Lyra to a secluded cabin deep in the woods. It was a modest refuge, far removed from the dangers they had left behind. But it felt like the only safe place for now. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow over their surroundings, as if the world outside was waiting for them to catch their breath. Lyra sat by the dim fire, her eyes distant, lost in thoughts of the journey that had led her here. Magnus sat across from her, his mind racing with questions that he couldn't quite bring himself to ask. He had only known her for a short while, yet her presence felt oddly familiar, like an unfinished chapter in a story he never realized he was a part of. As the fire crackled, Lyra's voice broke the silence, her tone quiet but laced with a deep sorrow that seemed to echo in the stillness. She began to speak of her past, her life before the shadows, the mission that had brought her to Earth, and the unimaginable truth she had carried within her for as long as she could remember. The words she spoke were nothing short of astonishing. Her eyes grew darker as she described the shadows, a group far more powerful and dangerous than anything Magnus had ever encountered. They weren't just after her, they sought control over everything. Time, space, entire realities. Magnus listened intently, his mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of her words. She spoke of wars that spanned galaxies, of ancient civilizations lost to time, of battles fought across the fabric of existence itself. The more she revealed, the more his disbelief grew. But somewhere deep inside him, something stirred. It was as if her story had unlocked a part of him that had been dormant for far too long. A part of him that still believed in fighting for something greater than himself. Her words were impossible to ignore, and though he couldn't quite understand how or why, he felt an undeniable connection to her, a bond that seemed to transcend the boundaries of space and time. Despite the bizarre and fantastical nature of her tale, Magnus didn't question her. He didn't need to. There was a raw honesty in her voice, a vulnerability that spoke volumes. She wasn't telling him this to seek pity or sympathy. She was simply sharing the weight of her burdens, hoping that someone, anyone, would understand. And somehow, Magnus did. Lyra's eyes flickered to the fire, her gaze momentarily lost in the flames. She spoke of the shadows with a sense of urgency, as if their presence loomed over everything she said. "They're not just after me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They want to take everything. Everything we know. Time. Space. the very essence of existence. I'm just a small piece of the puzzle they're trying to fit together. But they won't stop until they have it all. Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Magnus could feel the weight of her confession pressing against his chest. He was no stranger to loss, to the pain of feeling powerless in the face of overwhelming odds, but this was something else entirely. The stakes she was describing were beyond anything he could have ever imagined. Yet, despite the enormity of her mission, despite the dangers that surely awaited them, Magnus couldn't bring himself to turn away. He stood up, his eyes never leaving hers. "If you want me to help, I will," he said, his voice steady, though his heart raced with 1,000 questions. "But you have to understand. I have no idea what I'm doing. This world, your world, it's beyond anything I can wrap my head around. I can't even begin to understand the things you've told me, but I know one thing. Whatever this is, I can't walk away from it. I won't leave you alone in this." Lyra's gaze softened as she met his eyes, a mixture of gratitude and something else. A quiet relief. She had never expected anyone to offer their help, let alone someone who knew so little about her world. Yet here he was, offering not only his protection, but his trust. In that moment, she knew that despite the chaos and the unknown, Magnus was the one person she could rely on. His words, though simple, were enough to ignite a spark of hope she had long since lost. She nodded slowly, her lips trembling as she spoke again. "I can't promise you it will be easy. I can't promise you that we'll make it out of this alive. But I can promise you that I won't give up. I've come too far, and I'll do whatever it takes to stop them. Even if it means fighting a war that spans across dimensions. Even if it means losing myself along the way." Magnus felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy cloak. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but he could sense the depth of her conviction. Her mission was more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight to protect everything she held dear. And somehow, that mission had become his, too. As the night wore on, they sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Magnus couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn his life had taken. A few hours ago, he had been a man alone in the wilderness, resigned to his solitary existence. Now, he was standing on the edge of something far larger than he could have ever imagined. Something that pulled at him with a force he couldn't explain. In that quiet moment, Magnus realized that he had made a choice. He had chosen to stand beside Lyra, to fight for her cause, to protect her from the unknown forces that pursued her. He didn't know where this path would lead, or what dangers awaited them. But he knew that this was no longer just her fight. It was theirs. Together. And no matter what secrets were still to be revealed, Magnus had made a vow. To face them all, side by side with the woman who had unwittingly brought him back to life. As the days passed, the bond between Magnus and Lyra grew stronger. Each shared moment knitting their lives together in ways neither of them had anticipated. What began as an unexpected encounter in the woods had blossomed into something deeper, more profound. They faced obstacles together, overcoming the threats that shadowed their every step, and with each victory, they found themselves growing closer, not just in their fight against the forces pursuing them, but in the quiet moments of vulnerability they shared. It was during the stillness of the night, when the moon hung high in the sky, casting its soft glow over the world below, that they found their most intimate moments. They would sit side by the flickering fire, the night air cool against their skin, and they'd talk. Sometimes about trivial things, like the beauty of the stars above or the taste of the food they managed to scavenge. But most often, they spoke of their pasts, their losses, and the pain they had carried for so long. Magnus spoke little of his own history, preferring to listen to Lyra as she unveiled pieces of her life, the pieces that had shaped her into the person sitting beside him now. There was something undeniably magnetic about her, something raw in her honesty that made Magnus feel a connection deeper than he could put into words. In her eyes, he saw not just the scars of battle, but a person who had survived a lifetime of hardships and still found a way to keep moving forward. For Lyra, these conversations were like a release, a rare opportunity to unburden herself of the weight she had carried alone for so long. Her voice would tremble slightly as she recounted the most painful moments of her life, but there was a steady strength beneath the vulnerability. And when she finished speaking, it was often in silence that they sat, the firelight dancing in their eyes, each of them processing the unspoken emotions in the air between them. There were moments when their eyes would meet, and the connection between them felt so tangible, so undeniable, that it sent a wave of warmth through their bodies. It wasn't the kind of connection that could be explained easily. It was more of a shared understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement that something was blossoming between them, something neither of them had expected or prepared for. As the days wore on, Magnus couldn't help but feel the pull of something he hadn't experienced in years. He had spent so long in solitude, convinced that the pain of his past was too great for him to ever truly open his heart again. But with Lyra, it felt different. There was no rush, no pressure, just a quiet, steady, growing bond that left him feeling both vulnerable and alive. And in his heart, he knew that he had begun to fall for her. Lyra, too, felt the shift within herself. She had spent most of her life running from the shadows, from her past, from the very idea of love itself. Her heart had been hardened by betrayal, by loss, and by the endless cycle of survival. But with Magnus, something was different. There was no judgment in his eyes, no fear of what she had done or what she had become. Instead, there was understanding, compassion, and something softer, something that made her feel safe. Safe enough to let her guard down. Safe enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could allow herself to feel love again. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of the cabin, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire, Magnus turned to her, his voice breaking the silence. "I don't know why I feel this way," he admitted, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "But I know one thing for sure. I can't leave you. Not now. Not after everything we've been through." Lyra met his gaze, her heart thudding in her chest. She had never heard anyone speak to her like this before. And in that moment, her own feelings, ones she had tried so hard to suppress, began to surface. She had trusted Magnus with her life, but now, she realized, she also trusted him with her heart. "You're the only one I can trust," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I don't want to lose you." The words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Neither of them spoke further, but in that shared silence, something profound passed between them. It wasn't love in the conventional sense, not yet. But it was something that had the potential to grow into something even more beautiful and deep than they could ever imagine. In that quiet moment, Magnus and Lyra both understood what had been building between them. It wasn't just the desire to survive, to protect each other from the darkness that hunted them. It was a deeper, more personal connection, a bond formed not out of necessity, but out of mutual respect, understanding, and an unspoken promise to never leave the other behind. As the fire flickered low, casting long shadows on the walls, they sat together, side by side, with nothing left to say, but everything left to feel. The love that had slowly blossomed between Magnus and Lyra was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have predicted. What had once been a peaceful existence, a quiet escape from the dangers of the world, was now overshadowed by the relentless pursuit of the shadows. The dark organization that had haunted Lyra for so long was closing in, and every day they spent together seemed to bring them closer to a final, inevitable confrontation. Yet, despite the danger, Magnus and Lyra found themselves growing closer. Every moment they shared, every quiet conversation in the middle of the night, only deepened their bond. But as the threat of the shadows loomed larger, they both understood that their love would face challenges unlike any they had ever known. Their journey had only just begun, and the road ahead was filled with peril, uncertainty, and impossible decisions. The danger was no longer just external. It was personal. Every step they took brought them closer to the breaking point. Magnus, who had spent most of his life in solitude, found himself constantly battling the fear of losing Lyra. She was everything he had come to care for, everything he had never allowed himself to want, and the thought of losing her was more than he could bear. But even in his fear, he knew he could not let her go. She was his strength, his purpose, and as the shadows closed in on them, he made a promise to himself and to her that he would fight with everything he had. For Lyra, the battle was even more intense. She had lived a life on the run, one filled with secrecy and pain. Her past, her mission, and the very organization that hunted her now seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. But in Magnus, she saw something different, a future. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. His presence gave her a sense of peace, and his love filled a void she had thought could never be filled. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about hope, and about choosing to fight for a future, even when everything seemed impossible. As they fled through the dense forest, the sounds of the shadows' pursuit growing louder, they knew their time was running out. Magnus took her hand, squeezing it tightly as they navigated the rough terrain. "We'll make it through this," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I won't let them take you. We'll fight until the very end." Lyra met his gaze, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. She had always been the one to run, the one who kept moving forward because there was no other choice. But now, with Magnus by her side, she understood something she hadn't before. Love wasn't just about survival. It was about standing firm, facing the impossible, and knowing that together, they were stronger than anything that threatened to tear them apart. "You are the strength I need," she replied, her voice unwavering despite the fear that lingered in her chest. "You are the reason I keep fighting. I won't give up. Not now. Not ever." Their words were more than just promises. They were a vow. In that moment, with the shadows creeping ever closer, they both knew that no matter what happened, they would stand side by side. The world around them might crumble, and the danger they faced might seem insurmountable. But their commitment to each other was unwavering. Magnus and Lyra had learned something invaluable: the power of love, of trust, of fighting not just for survival, but for each other. The road ahead was unclear, and the shadows were relentless, but they had one thing the enemy could never take away: each other. Together they would face the challenges ahead, no matter how impossible they seemed. With every step, they grew stronger, more determined. And with each moment they shared, they knew that the love they had was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. In that quiet, shared understanding, Magnus and Lyra found the courage they needed. They would not just survive, they would fight for a future together. And with every threat they faced, they would prove that their love was the strongest force of all. The tension between Magnus and Lyra had reached a breaking point. The ever-looming threat of the shadows grew closer with each passing day. The relentless pursuit of the organization that had haunted Lyra for so long was finally closing in, and no place seemed safe anymore. That night, they found refuge in a small makeshift cave, hoping the shadows would pass them by. But even in the quiet darkness, the weight of what was to come hung heavily between them. They knew that time was running out. The choices they had to make were becoming impossible. As they sat in the cave, the flickering light of a small fire casting long shadows on the stone walls, Magnus's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had to give. The shadows were getting closer, and with every moment they stayed hidden, the risk of them being discovered grew exponentially. His heart pounded as he thought of Lyra. His heart, his reason for fighting. She had become everything to him, and the thought of losing her tore him apart. But in that moment of desperation, Magnus realized the unthinkable. If they were going to survive, one of them might have to sacrifice their freedom, perhaps even their life. He looked at Lyra, her face illuminated by the dim firelight, and the weight of the decision crushed him. He couldn't let the shadows get to her. He would rather face anything than see her fall into their hands. The idea of her being alone, unprotected, gnawed at him. He spoke, his voice shaky, but determined. "You can't go on like this, Lyra. You're too important, too precious. If they find us here, I can't protect you. I can't let them hurt you. Maybe Maybe you should go. Alone. I'll hold them off, and you can escape. Lyra's eyes widened, her expression one of disbelief. The words didn't make sense to her. How could he even suggest that? She had already given up everything for the sake of survival. But now, Magnus wanted her to leave him. The very idea felt wrong, almost unbearable. She could see the pain in his eyes, but she refused to accept it. No, she replied firmly, shaking her head as she moved closer to him. You're wrong. I'm not leaving you. I can't. You're the only reason I'm still here. You're the only one I trust. I've lost everything already. I'm not losing you too. Her voice trembled, but it was filled with a determination that matched his own. She wasn't willing to let him sacrifice himself for her. Their bond had become something stronger than the fear that the shadows instilled in them both. It was love, yes. But it was also something deeper. An unwavering commitment to protect each other, no matter the cost. Magnus felt a lump form in his throat. Her words pierced through him, like a sharp arrow that struck the core of his being. He could feel the weight of her sacrifice, of her willingness to face the unknown with him. She wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting for him. For them. In that moment, he knew that he couldn't let her face this alone either. They had to face the danger together, or not at all. As the night stretched on, the cave filled with the sounds of their breathing, the crackling of the fire, and the beating of their hearts. They both knew the stakes. They were about to face something that could tear them apart, but the strength of their bond gave them the courage to face it together. Whatever happened next, whatever trials the shadows brought, they would not allow fear to drive them apart. In that quiet, fragile moment, they made a promise without words. They would fight side by side. They would sacrifice everything for each other, and they would never back down. The world outside was unforgiving, but within the walls of that cave, their love was all that mattered. And even in the face of everything they stood to lose, it was enough to keep them going. Magnus pulled Lyra close, holding her with a quiet intensity that spoke volumes. The road ahead was uncertain, the dangers ahead unimaginable. But together, they were stronger than the shadows. Together, they had everything they needed to face the darkest of times. And no matter what came next, they knew they had each other. That was their greatest strength, and it was all they would ever need. The battle with the shadows had always been brutal, but this time it felt different. It was as if the very air had thickened with the weight of an impending loss. Magnus and Lyra had been running for so long, always a step ahead, always fighting for a sliver of safety. But now, the unthinkable had happened. Lyra had been taken. The shadows, relentless as ever, had captured her in a daring raid, leaving Magnus alone in the face of their terrifying power. The anger and fear surged through him like wildfire. But deep down, something else gripped him. The overwhelming need to rescue her, to save the woman he loved no matter the cost. Magnus wasted no time. He knew he had to confront the shadows head-on, not just to free Lyra, but to face the truths he had been avoiding for so long. As he infiltrated their stronghold, the truth hit him like a tidal wave. Lyra was not who she seemed. She was no ordinary woman. She wasn't even human. She was an alien, a being from another world, with powers that could reshape reality itself. The revelation was staggering, and for a moment, Magnus stood still, his mind spinning, trying to grasp the enormity of it all. But even as the shock reverberated through him, one thing became painfully clear. Nothing about Lyra had ever felt less than real to him. She was still the same woman, the same person he had fallen in love with. And that love was unwavering. Magnus's heart raced as he finally reached her, his hands trembling as he untied the ropes binding her. Lyra's face was pale, her usual spark dimmed, and he could see the toll her captivity had taken on her. But it wasn't just the physical exhaustion that drained her. It was something deeper. She had sacrificed her power, the very essence of who she was, to protect him. The realization hit Magnus harder than anything else. Lyra, the powerful being who could have easily destroyed their enemies, had willingly given it all up for him. And now, she was vulnerable, more fragile than ever before. As he helped her to her feet, his voice cracked with emotion. "Lyra, you're an alien? From another world?" She met his gaze, her eyes filled with both fear and relief. The truth, long kept hidden, had finally been laid bare. "Yes, Magnus, I am. But I'm still me. I haven't changed. I never wanted to be anything else." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if she feared his reaction. "Can you still love me, even knowing the truth?" Magnus didn't hesitate. His heart had already made its choice, long before this moment. He took her hand gently, his touch warm and steady, offering her the comfort she needed. "You don't have to change. I love you, Lyra. No matter who or what you are. You're still the person I've come to care about, and that will never change." In that moment, it wasn't just the words that mattered, but the feeling behind them, the sincerity, the certainty. Lyra had spent so much of her life hiding, running from the truth, fearing that she could never truly belong anywhere. But here, with Magnus, she had found something she never thought possible: acceptance. Magnus saw the tears well up in her eyes. But they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of knowing that despite the vastness of the universe and the differences that should have kept them apart, they had found something stronger: love. For the first time, Lyra felt like she truly belonged, not because she was from Earth or another world, but because Magnus saw her for who she truly was, without judgment, without hesitation. As they embraced, the world outside seemed to fade away. There was no longer any fear of what they couldn't control. They had each other, and that was enough. The shadows could take everything else, but they couldn't take the bond they had formed. No matter how many battles they would face in the future, no matter how difficult the road ahead, they knew they would never be alone again. In that quiet moment, Magnus and Lyra realized that love wasn't just about accepting each other's strengths. It was about embracing the imperfections, the secrets, and the truths that made them who they were. They had found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for, and together they would face whatever came next, as one. After Lyra's abduction, the weight of the world seemed to press down on Magnus. The shadows had taken her from him, and he was determined to find her, no matter the cost. But this wasn't going to be a simple rescue mission. What lay ahead of them was not just a physical battle, but a journey that would test every fiber of their being. It was a challenge that would stretch both his body and soul. For Magnus, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Lyra wasn't just someone he cared for. She was the very reason he felt alive. Without her, he feared he'd be left with nothing but a void. This mission was no longer about revenge or survival. It was about saving the woman who had shown him a love he never thought possible. Magnus wasn't alone in this quest. Alongside him were new allies. Strangers who, like him, had suffered at the hands of the shadows and who now fought to stop their reign of terror. They had all seen the damage the shadows could do, and they shared a common goal: to put an end to their cruelty. Magnus wasn't sure what to expect from these people, but their willingness to stand with him gave him a small sliver of hope. There was something deeply moving in seeing the solidarity among them. They weren't just fighting for their own freedom. They were fighting for the future of everyone, and for the love that had already been forged between him and Lyra. The road ahead was treacherous, filled with dangers both visible and unseen. Every step they took was met with resistance. The shadows were always a step ahead, and Magnus couldn't shake the fear that they might lose Lyra forever. The thought of never seeing her again, of never holding her hand or hearing her laugh, gnawed at him constantly. It was in these moments of doubt that Magnus's mind began to spiral. Was he strong enough to keep going? Could he really save her? His heart weighed heavily with the knowledge that time was running out. The more they pressed forward, the more his own fears began to tear at the fabric of his resolve. But it was also during these moments of despair that Magnus began to realize something deeper. Love wasn't just a fleeting emotion. It wasn't something that could simply be shaken off or easily replaced. His love for Lyra wasn't something he could lose, even in the face of the greatest challenges. It had become a part of him, woven into his very being. He couldn't let her go, not because he feared being alone, but because she was an inseparable part of who he was now. He had no choice but to keep moving forward, to fight with every ounce of strength he had, because that was what love demanded. The group faced hardships they never expected: treacherous terrain, battles with forces stronger than they anticipated, and traps set by the shadows to slow their progress. Each setback brought them closer to their breaking point. Magnus found himself questioning everything at times. Was this all worth it? Would it be enough? But every time he stumbled, he remembered Lyra. He thought of her strength, her warmth, and the way she made him feel alive. That thought alone was enough to keep him going. Even when his body ached and his mind was clouded with doubt, the image of her kept him moving. One night, as they camped by a flickering fire, one of his new friends, a fellow fighter named Arik, noticed the exhaustion in Magnus's eyes. Arik had been through his own share of loss, and he understood the pain that was driving Magnus forward. He placed a hand on Magnus's shoulder and spoke words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "We will find her, Magnus. We'll do whatever it takes," Arik said. "But remember, you're not alone in this. She won't give up on you either." Those words, simple as they were, struck something deep inside of Magnus. In that moment, he realized that he wasn't just fighting for Lyra. He was fighting for the love they shared, for the life they had yet to live. He wasn't alone in this struggle. His friends, his new allies, were with him every step of the way, and Lyra, despite being far away, was with him in spirit. The thought of her was the flame that kept him going when all seemed dark. The journey continued, and with each passing day, Magnus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the path would not be easy, that the shadows would fight back with everything they had. But as long as he had love, as long as he had this driving force inside him, he would not stop. Magnus's love for Lyra had become his strength, his shield, and his reason for living. It was no longer just about saving her. It was about saving the very essence of who they were together. The fight to rescue Lyra was far from over, but Magnus had found something in the midst of it all. Something far more powerful than any weapon or strength. The unwavering conviction that love could conquer even the greatest of evils. And with that knowledge, he would stop at nothing to bring her back. He would find her, no matter the cost. After what seemed like an endless pursuit, Magnus and his newly formed team finally tracked down the place where Lyra was being held captive. The shadows, in their twisted quest for power, had subjected her to dangerous experiments, pushing the limits of her strength and resilience. But the time had come. They were no longer running. With every ounce of courage, every bit of strength they had, they were ready to face whatever came next. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the final confrontation was inevitable. Magnus and his team would have to battle the most dangerous foes they had yet encountered, enemies that were more powerful and prepared than anything they had faced before. As they stormed the facility, chaos erupted. The sounds of gunfire, shouts, and the clash of bodies filled the air, and Magnus found himself fighting harder than ever. His body ached, but his mind never wavered. Lyra's face, her smile, her gentle touch, the love that had blossomed between them, kept him focused. But with every victory, there was another obstacle, another fight that drained them further. It seemed like the more they fought, the closer the end was creeping in. Just as it appeared that the battle was lost and all hope seemed to be slipping through his fingers, Magnus found himself face to face with a chilling reality. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and overwhelmed. His team was barely holding their ground, and the shadows were closing in. It felt as though the world had come to a standstill, and the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his chest. He couldn't protect everyone. He couldn't save Lyra. But then, something extraordinary happened. In that moment of despair, when everything seemed lost, Lyra's voice rang out, steady and powerful. filled with a strength Magnus had never seen before. She tapped into the very essence of her power. But it wasn't just her alien abilities that surged forth. It was something much deeper. It was the love she had for Magnus, the unyielding love that had fueled her every decision, every step she took to be by his side. In a dazzling surge of energy, Lyra's strength radiated outward, knocking back the enemies that surrounded them and providing Magnus and his team with the opening they needed to strike back. The air crackled with raw energy as the shadows fell before them. Lyra's actions had turned the tide of the battle, saving Magnus, and ultimately, their entire team. But what she did wasn't just a physical act of power. It was an act of love so pure and intense that it became a weapon far stronger than any physical force. She had given everything, not because she was capable of great strength, but because she was capable of an even greater love, one that transcended space, time, and the impossible odds stacked against them. As the dust settled and the last of the shadows were defeated, Magnus rushed to Lyra's side. She was weak from the exertion, but the glow of victory in her eyes was undeniable. Magnus knelt beside her, a rush of emotions flooding through him. He had feared he would lose her, that this mission would cost him everything. But now, against all odds, they had succeeded. They had both survived, and they could finally breathe in the peace that followed. With Lyra in his arms, Magnus whispered the words he had held in his heart for so long. He wasn't sure if they could ever truly convey the depth of his feelings, but he said them anyway. "You saved me, Lyra. You saved all of us. You're the reason I'm still alive. I'll never leave you." Lyra, her strength returning in the wake of their triumph, looked up at him with a soft smile, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "You saved me once, Magnus. I will never leave you, no matter what." In that moment, they understood something profound. Their love, forged through hardship and sacrifice, had not only brought them together, it had become their greatest strength. It was no longer just a bond between two people. It was the force that had allowed them to survive, to fight, and to conquer the impossible. What had begun as a connection between a man and a mysterious woman from another world had blossomed into something unshakable, something that could not be broken by the forces of the shadows or any obstacle that lay ahead. Together, they had conquered the greatest challenge of their lives, and their love had emerged victorious. Across the galaxies, across time itself. You've found your way here. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.